The evening started like any other high-profile event, with the glitter of chandeliers reflecting off the polished floors, the soft hum of conversations drifting through the grand hall, and the low notes of a string quartet providing the perfect background for what was meant to be a glamorous night. Guests arrived dressed in sparkling gowns and tailored suits, exchanging polite smiles, handshakes, and greetings rehearsed more for appearance than genuine warmth. Cameras flashed intermittently, capturing the carefully curated glamour of the evening, and the air buzzed with excitement and subtle tension. It was one of those events where every move seemed to be watched, every word analyzed, and every reaction recorded. Whether anyone intended it or not, among the crowd, one actress quietly made her way through the room. She moved with the ease of someone who had walked through such spaces countless times, her smile calm, her posture poised. Her reputation for warmth and professionalism preceded her, but tonight something felt different. There was a subtle tension in the air, a shift that wasn't immediately obvious to others, but she could sense it. The usual welcoming smiles and nods that greeted her seemed slightly forced, more like obligations than genuine acknowledgments. Even before reaching the main seating area, there were tiny indicators of what was about to come, small gestures that seemed off. A misplaced comment, a laugh a little too loud. It began quietly. Someone mispronounced her name while introducing her at the start of the program. At first, she thought it was an honest mistake, the kind that happens often in large gatherings. But as the night progressed, more subtle acts started to pile up. Her assigned seat had been shifted slightly, placing her further from the main table and subtly away from the center of attention. While others were engaged in polite chatter and laughter, small jokes about her past roles and performances floated through the air, thinly veiled as humor, but unmistakably pointed. Each time she smiled politely, nodded, and kept her composure, but inwardly a tight knot formed in her chest. She had endured criticism and judgment throughout her career, but there was something different about this evening. It was personal, deliberate, yet coated with enough civility that she couldn't openly challenge it without seeming dramatic. Despite the growing discomfort, she maintained her outward calm. Her hands rested gently in her lap, her posture steady, and her eyes carried the same warmth she was known for. She greeted people when required, responded to compliments, and offered small talk that was polite and genuine. Yet beneath that calm exterior, her mind raced. She reflected on her career, the years of auditions, long nights on set, moments of doubt and struggle that no one ever saw. She thought about the countless times she had been underestimated or overlooked, the moments where talent wasn't enough, and the resilience it took to continue forward. Each memory, each struggle, seemed to sharpen her focus tonight, making her more aware of the subtle cruelties around her. It was a test of patience and endurance. The laughter at her expense was quiet but persistent, the kind of mockery that tries to appear innocent but carries an unmistakable sting. It wasn't an outburst or a public spectacle, with a series of small, calculated jabs that seemed to accumulate with each passing minute. People around her either didn't notice or chose not to intervene, engrossed in their own conversations, unaware of the quiet tension building at the edges of the room. And yet she refused to let it break her. She had faced scrutiny before, both public and private, and she knew that dignity in moments like these often spoke louder than words. As the evening continued, she began to observe the people responsible for the whispers and subtle gestures. They moved through the room with practiced confidence, smiling at others while occasionally glancing in her direction, their eyes carrying the faint glint of amusement at her expense. It was an odd mix of confidence and cruelty, the kind that relies on subtlety to maintain plausible deniability. She could see it, and she understood it, but she refused to let it dominate her. Instead, she focused on herself, on maintaining her composure, her grace, and the quiet strength that had carried her through her career. Her thoughts wandered to the irony of the situation. Here she was, celebrated for her talent and her kindness, yet subjected to the kind of humiliation that often goes unnoticed by the majority of people. It was a reminder of how easily people could overlook humanity in favor of entertainment, amusement, or ego. She reminded herself that her value wasn't determined by their approval or laughter. Her achievements, her compassion, and her perseverance mattered far more than the fleeting amusement of those who sought to undermine her. As she continued to navigate the room, she noticed the subtle ways people tried to involve her in conversation, often with underlying tones of insincerity. The questions were superficial, the compliments hollow, and the laughter forced. She responded with her usual warmth, engaging politely, but inside she catalogued each gesture, each remark, each small attempt at humiliation. It wasn't bitterness that she felt, it was awareness. Awareness of the environment, awareness of human behavior, and awareness of how moments like this could reveal the character of those around her. Despite the discomfort, there was an odd sense of clarity in the situation. The humiliation, as painful as it was, allowed her to see people for who they truly were. The laughter that was meant to belittle her instead became a mirror reflecting insecurities, pretenses, and unspoken tensions within the room. And though she didn't allow herself to show it, each passing moment strengthened her resolve. She had faced challenges before, ones far greater than a few hours of subtle mockery. And she knew that this evening would pass just like any other obstacle she had overcome. There were moments when she caught herself imagining what it would be like if she responded with anger or sharp words. But she quickly dismissed the thought. Anger might satisfy in the short term, but it would never provide the quiet victory of patience, observation, and grace. She realized that sometimes enduring with dignity and allowing truth to emerge naturally was far more powerful than any confrontation. Each time someone laughed at her, she imagined it as water flowing around her, unable to erode the foundation she had built over decades. At one point, as she moved toward the center of the room to accept a brief acknowledgement for her contributions, a hush seemed to fall over the group around her. The subtle acts of mockery paused, if only for a moment, as all eyes turned toward the main stage. She felt the weight of the moment, but also the strength that came with surviving countless similar situations. It was here, in this quiet pause, that she realized something important. Humiliation, while uncomfortable, could not define her. Her response, her patience, and her composure would ultimately speak louder than any ridicule thrown her way. Throughout the night, she remained aware of the hidden dynamics in the room, the alliances, the pretenses, the subtle power plays. But she also noticed another presence, someone quiet, observing not with judgment but with awareness. There was a sense of recognition in their gaze, a quiet acknowledgement that she was being treated unfairly. It was a small but significant comfort, a reminder that even in the midst of public humiliation, there were those who saw the truth, who understood the difference between genuine respect and hollow amusement. By the end of the first part of the evening, she had endured the subtle cruelties with grace. She had maintained her composure, her warmth, and her dignity, all while quietly observing the behaviors around her. The humiliation had been real, but it had not broken her. Instead, it had sharpened her awareness, strengthened her resolve, and reminded her of the quiet power of patience and endurance. The night was far from over, and she knew challenges remained, but she faced them not with fear or anger, but with calm confidence. She understood that sometimes the most powerful response was simply to remain true to oneself while letting the situation reveal its own consequences. As she prepared for the next phase of the evening, she carried with her a quiet strength. She knew that while some may try to diminish others for amusement, dignity, kindness, and patience would always leave a mark far longer than laughter ever could. And so, she moved forward, not as a victim of subtle cruelty, but as a woman aware of her own value, her own power, and the fact that those who sought to humiliate her would ultimately reveal more about themselves than they could ever reveal about her. As the evening continued, the room was alive with chatter, laughter, and the soft clinking of glasses. Yet amidst the noise, one person quietly observed from across the room. Known for his calm presence and the rare ability to notice what others often ignore, he saw the subtle tension in her posture, the forced smiles, and the polite nods that barely masked discomfort. Unlike most who were absorbed in their own conversations or distracted by the glamour, he paid attention. He noticed the small gestures of mockery, the whispered jokes, The way some people's eyes lingered just a little too long, filled with amusement at her expense. It was subtle, almost invisible to the casual observer, but he saw it. And in that moment, he didn't rush in or make a scene. He simply watched, quietly assessing the situation, understanding without judgment. He knew that rushing in could make the situation worse, could draw unwanted attention, or make it seem as though he was overreacting. Instead, he chose to let the room speak for itself, to see how people treated someone when they thought no one was truly paying attention. There was a kind of power in silence, he realized, and patience often revealed more than immediate action ever could from where he stood. He could see the subtle cracks forming in the carefully curated facades of those mocking her. A slight hesitation in a laugh, an awkward glance at a peer, a faltering smile, all small signs that even the most practiced acts of cruelty had an impact. And yet she continued to maintain her composure, moving through the room with calm grace, engaging politely when addressed, and responding with warmth to the few genuine compliments she received. Her strength was quiet but undeniable. It was the kind of presence that made people take notice without her ever needing to demand it. He took a moment to reflect on what it meant to truly see someone in their moment of struggle. It wasn't about rescuing them or intervening dramatically. It was about acknowledgement, recognition, and understanding. Sometimes all someone needed was to know that someone else noticed, that their experience wasn't invisible. And that was exactly what he intended to do. Not with a speech or a confrontation, but with subtlety and care. The way he believed the moment deserved. As the program progressed, he began to move closer, though still at a distance that allowed him to observe without intruding. He watched the way she interacted with others, the polite laughter, the slight nods, the soft-spoken words that conveyed kindness even in discomfort. And he saw the way the others responded, some with genuine interest, others with feigned attention, still others with barely hidden amusement. He noted each interaction carefully, quietly building an understanding of the dynamics at play, and preparing himself to act in a way that would be measured, respectful, and on PACTFUL. It was during a brief pause in the program that an opportunity presented itself. She had moved toward the center of the room to accept a small acknowledgement for her contributions to a recent project. The applause was polite but restrained, and the whispers resumed almost immediately afterward. He noticed the faint shadow of disappointment cross her face, quickly replaced by her signature calm smile. The subtle humiliation continued, even in moments meant to honor her, and he realized that this wasn't just a series of small, random acts. It was deliberate. The room had allowed cruelty to become invisible, and someone needed to shine a light on it. He didn't approach her directly just yet. Instead, he took a position where he could subtly influence the environment, making himself visible to her without drawing attention from the others. His calm presence alone seemed to shift the energy, though no one else could articulate why. There was a quiet assurance in the way he stood, a groundedness that suggested observation and understanding rather than judgment. And she, though unaware of his exact thoughts, seemed to sense it. Her posture relaxed slightly, her breathing eased, and a faint smile crossed her face, as if she knew that she was no longer completely alone in the room. The night continued, and small moments unfolded that would have gone unnoticed by anyone not paying attention. A server carrying a tray paused for just a moment too long near a group making subtle jokes, giving her a chance to move past without further discomfort. A conversation nearby softened when his gaze briefly met one of the instigators, though nothing was said, simply the unspoken understanding that someone was watching. These small shifts didn't require dramatic action, but they began to change the energy of the room. It was subtle, yet profound. As she moved through the crowd, he noticed the strain in her eyes that she tried to hide behind polite smiles. He remembered moments from his own life when being overlooked or humiliated had felt isolating, and he understood the importance of acknowledgement. Sometimes the smallest gestures, a look of recognition, a nod of understanding, could provide more strength than grand acts of rescue. And that was the approach he chose. He wouldn't seek to embarrass those who had mocked her. He simply intended to ensure that the truth of the moment was visible. that dignity was recognized, and that kindness had its own quiet influence. At one point, a conversation nearby threatened to escalate the discomfort. A joke at her expense was about to be repeated when his presence seemed to interrupt the flow, not with words but with timing and attention. The laughter faltered for a moment, the words hung in the air, and the room shifted in response. People felt the weight of being observed, and the subtle act of cruelty lost its power. She noticed the change, though she didn't yet know the cause. A flicker of hope crossed her mind, the sense that perhaps someone was aware, someone was present, someone understood. He continued to move with quiet purpose, always keeping a respectful distance. He observed the interactions, the body language, the undercurrents of emotion that ran beneath the polite facades. And in each observation, he silently reinforced the idea that kindness, patience, and dignity could counteract cruelty without confrontation. There was a lesson unfolding, not for her alone, but for everyone in the room who was watching, consciously or unconsciously. Actions, even subtle ones, carried meaning. And sometimes, simply noticing and valuing someone's humanity could shift an entire atmosphere. Throughout the night, he remained aware of his own presence, ensuring it never overshadowed her or drew unwanted attention. His role was not to dominate, but to support in a way that allowed her strength to shine naturally. He saw her resilience, her composure, and her kindness, and he understood that these qualities needed no amplification. They spoke for themselves. What they lacked was acknowledgement, and that was something he could provide quietly, subtly and powerfully. As the program moved forward, he observed a moment when she was about to leave the center of attention, just as the polite applause died down. He could see the fleeting disappointment in her eyes, the tiny hesitation in her steps. And in that moment, he realized that his presence had already begun to make a difference. She stood taller, breathed a little easier, and moved with a sense of confidence that had been momentarily diminished earlier in the evening. The acknowledgement didn't need to be loud or dramatic, it simply needed to exist. Even the subtle energy in the room seemed to shift. Those who had been mocking her earlier began to sense a change, though they couldn't identify its source. The laughter was less sharp, the jokes faltered, and the air carried a faint sense of reflection. It wasn't a confrontation, and it wasn't revenge, it was a quiet recalibration of awareness. Sometimes the most profound influence wasn't in words, but in presence, in observation, and in the silent assertion that dignity could not be dismissed. By the end of this part of the evening, it was clear that a subtle shift had occurred. She had endured the initial humiliation, maintained her composure, and now had a quiet support. Someone who understood without needing to speak. The room was still alive with chatter and movement, but the undercurrent of cruelty had begun to fade, replaced by a sense of respect, however unspoken. It was the beginning of a turning point, one that would continue to unfold in the coming moments, revealing that patience, awareness, and quiet presence could create ripples far greater than the immediate act of humiliation. She may not have realized it fully yet, but the evening was no longer the same. What had begun as a night of subtle cruelty was slowly transforming into a moment where dignity, empathy, and quiet understanding held more power than ridicule. And in the background, he continued to watch, ensuring that the momentum continued, that kindness and acknowledgement were present, and that the truth of the evening, her strength, her resilience, and her humanity was visible to anyone paying attention. The night had reached a quiet tension, one that most of the guests didn't consciously notice, but it lingered in the air like a subtle current beneath the chatter and laughter. She had spent hours maintaining her composure, smiling politely, responding to greetings, and navigating the small waves of mockery and dismissive behavior with grace. The calm she carried was both impressive and exhausting. It took a lot of energy to keep the mask of serenity when the undercurrent of cruelty threatened to weigh her down. Yet she continued, reminding herself that dignity often meant enduring moments that others could not see clearly, moments that tested patience more than talent. Meanwhile, he remained a quiet presence at the edge of the room, watching and observing. His eyes followed her as she moved through groups of people, noting the subtle exchanges, the polite laughter that barely hid the barbs beneath, and the way her eyes carried a mix of awareness and quiet hurt. It was never about intervening aggressively for him. He believed in subtlety, in allowing the moment to unfold naturally, and in giving space for people's true characters to reveal themselves. He could see the discomfort she endured, and he understood that even small acts of acknowledgement could change everything. As the program continued, an opportunity arose. The host, a well-known figure with a commanding presence, called her name to come forward for a short acknowledgement. The room turned its attention toward her, some guests clapping politely while others whispered behind their hands, unsure of how to react. She stepped forward with the same calm grace she had maintained all evening, but inside there was a mix of nerves and anticipation. This moment, brief as it was, held more weight than anyone in the room could understand. It was not just about recognition for her achievements, it was a chance to reclaim dignity in a space that had tried to subtly diminish her. As she approached the center of attention, the whispers seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet hum of expectation. He noticed the subtle shift in her body language as she straightened her posture, lifted her chin slightly, and took a steadying breath. There was a calmness in her presence that contrasted with the nervous energy around her. And then he decided to act not with words yet, but with a gesture of acknowledgement that would ripple through the room. His eyes met hers for a moment, a simple but profound connection, and she felt it immediately. That tiny moment of recognition gave her strength, a sense that she was truly seen, and that she was not alone in the room. When the host spoke her name and began to introduce her, the usual interruptions and whispers from the crowd were met with a subtle change. Some of the people who had been making jokes faltered for a moment, unsure of why the energy had shifted. She continued forward, each step deliberate, each movement carrying calm assurance. Her voice, when she spoke a few words of thanks, was steady and warm, conveying not only gratitude but the quiet dignity that had been her companion throughout the evening. Every eye that followed her now could sense the difference in her presence, the quiet power that came from composure, patience, and self-respect. He noticed the subtle reactions of the crowd as well. The people who had mocked her before now seemed uncertain, their laughter disappearing, replaced by a faint awareness that something had changed. It wasn't that they had been confronted directly, it was that they had been seen. For a moment, the room felt smaller, more honest, and more aware of the dynamics that had been unfolding in the background. And she, standing in the spotlight, absorbed the change in energy with quiet confidence. She was no longer simply enduring. She was being acknowledged, and the room had begun to recalibrate itself around that truth. The acknowledgement, small as it seemed, began to shift the atmosphere in a way that was almost tangible. People began to look at her differently, some with genuine admiration, others with a hesitant recognition of their own behavior. The energy that had been directed towards subtle cruelty was now redirected into something quieter, more reflective. She had become the center not because of spectacle, but because of a presence that demanded attention naturally, without force and without anger. It was the kind of power that couldn't be ignored. And it began to ripple outward, he continued to observe, quietly ensuring that the support remained. Though no one in the room yet realized the subtle guidance he provided. Each nod, each glance, each silent acknowledgement contributed to an environment where dignity was visible, and cruelty could no longer operate unchecked. He noticed the small but meaningful interactions around her, people stepping aside to allow her passage, whispers softening, smiles becoming more genuine, and understood that the first acknowledgement was only the beginning of the transformation. As she returned to her place among the guests, there was a visible change in her expression. Gone was the faint tension that had lingered in her shoulders. In its place was calm assurance. She carried herself with renewed confidence, knowing that her presence was recognized and that the small acts of subtle humiliation could no longer hold the same weight. And though she didn't yet know it fully, the quiet presence of someone who truly saw her had made all the difference. The evening continued, but the mood had changed. Conversations that had been filled with whispers and gentle jabs were now tempered by a sense of awareness. People who had once laughed at her expense now found themselves uncertain, reflecting on their behavior without knowing exactly why. And she moved through the room with the same warmth and composure, yet now there was a sense of quiet triumph in the way she carried herself. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. There were small moments that punctuated this shift. A guest who had been subtly mocking her earlier approached with a genuine compliment, hesitant but sincere. Another paused in mid-laughter when they realized their joke had lost its effect, replaced by the acknowledgement of the room that her presence mattered more than amusement. Even those who had been indifferent began to notice the change, and slowly, the atmosphere became one of respect rather than ridicule. He continued to stay at the edge of the room, careful not to draw attention to himself. His role was never to overshadow her, but to allow the environment to support her dignity naturally. By simply being present, by observing and acknowledging her, he influenced the subtle dynamics in a way that words alone could not. It was a quiet lesson in empathy, presence, and the impact of human awareness. As the evening progressed, she found herself reflecting on the experience. The humiliation she had endured earlier in the night now felt distant, softened by the acknowledgement she had received. She realized that the power of being seen, truly seen, was far greater than any insult or subtle joke. It was a reminder that even in moments of discomfort, dignity, grace, and patience could not only preserve one's strength but also gradually transform the environment around them. By the end of the third part of the evening, it was clear that a turning point had occurred. The subtle cruelty that had colored the earlier moments had begun to fade, replaced by recognition, respect, and quiet reflection. She had not confronted her critics directly, yet their power had diminished. She had maintained her composure, embraced her dignity, and allowed the presence of someone who truly noticed her to shift the energy of the room. And in that moment, she understood a profound truth. Strength was not always in retaliation or confrontation. It was often in enduring, observing, and allowing the truth to speak for itself. The final moments of this part of the evening were filled with a sense of calm accomplishment. She had faced humiliation with grace, navigated subtle cruelty with patience, and experienced the first public acknowledgement that validated her presence. The energy of the room had begun to realign, guided not by confrontation but by empathy, recognition, and the quiet power of someone who cared enough to notice. She had endured, but more importantly, she had begun to reclaim the narrative of the evening, and as she moved through the remaining hours of the event, she carried with her the quiet strength that comes from knowing one has remained true to oneself, even in moments of challenge. She understood that the subtle shifts in awareness, the small acknowledgments, and the presence of someone who genuinely observed her experience were far more impactful than any dramatic confrontation could have been. The evening had changed, not through spectacle, but through quiet dignity, patience, and the power of being truly seen. The evening had reached a moment where the tension, though faint, was palpable. She moved through the room with the calm assurance that had carried her through the night, yet every step was a careful balancing act. She knew the eyes of some were still watching, some still judging, some still whispering jokes that were meant to amuse at her expense. But something had shifted since the first acknowledgement. There was now a subtle awareness in the air, a quiet pause in the laughter, as if people had begun to feel the weight of their actions. Without being told directly, he had remained a quiet observer up to this point, but he understood that observation alone could only go so far. The room had begun to respect her presence, yes, but those who had been mocking her might still find ways to diminish her if left unchecked. He wanted to act, but not in a way that would embarrass anyone or create conflict. There was a certain elegance and subtlety in influencing the situation without force, in allowing dignity to rise naturally. That was the approach he chose. As the program moved forward, there was an opportunity. A segment of the evening involved a discussion of recent achievements in the industry, highlighting contributions that had made an impact. He noticed the way her name was once again mentioned, this time in a casual remark by the host, almost as an afterthought. But he could see her eyes flicker slightly, the faint tension returning as she prepared herself to respond politely. He realized this moment could be turned into something meaningful. a chance to publicly reinforce what everyone should already understand, that her talent and her character deserved respect. Instead of speaking immediately, he leaned slightly forward, his calm presence alone drawing attention without being overt. When the host hesitated to expand on her achievements, he subtly interjected, not in a confrontational tone, but with quiet authority and sincerity. His words highlighted her dedication, her perseverance, and the countless small acts of kindness and professionalism that had made her a respected figure in the industry. The room paused. For the first time since the evening began, the subtle cruelty was met with something more powerful than silence or patience. It was met with public acknowledgement from someone whose reputation and character carried weight. The effect was immediate. Guests who had been smirking, whispering, or subtly mocking her earlier now found themselves silent, unsure how to react. Some attempted polite applause, while others looked down, realizing in a quiet, uncomfortable way that their behavior had not gone unnoticed. She, standing in the center of the room, felt the shift instantly. Her posture straightened further, her shoulders relaxed, and a genuine smile crossed her face, not forced, not polite, but real. It was a smile that carried relief, gratitude, and the quiet triumph of being recognized in a space where she had felt invisible. He did not continue speaking or dominate the moment. That was not necessary. The simple act of acknowledgement, the recognition of her strength and contributions, had already changed the energy in the room. It was subtle but profound. The people who had sought to diminish her had no words to counter it. No gestures that could undo the quiet truth now visible to everyone. Respect had entered the room not through confrontation or spectacle, but through sincerity, empathy, and careful observation. She felt a warmth in the acknowledgement that went beyond mere recognition. It was validation of her years of hard work, her resilience through countless challenges, and her ability to maintain grace even when faced with discomfort. The power of being seen, truly seen, was more profound than any applause or compliment could have conveyed. And in that moment, she understood that dignity was not just about enduring humiliation, it was about allowing the truth of one's character to shine through. Even when others attempted to hide or diminish it, the subtle change rippled through the room. Guests who had previously whispered jokes now shifted in their seats, their expressions revealing surprise, hesitation, or quiet reflection. Even those who had been indifferent found themselves more attentive, noticing her presence in a way that had been absent earlier. The atmosphere was no longer about entertainment at her expense. It was about respect, acknowledgement, and awareness. That alone was a remarkable transformation, achieved not through anger or confrontation, but through careful, deliberate human action. He remained at a respectful distance, allowing her to bask in the moment without overshadowing her. His goal had never been to take credit or create drama. It was about balance, support, and ensuring that dignity was visible. Each gesture, each glance, each acknowledgement he offered was calculated to reinforce the respect she deserved without creating conflict or spectacle. The quiet power of presence, combined with sincere recognition, was enough to transform the dynamics of the evening. As the night progressed, more subtle interactions reinforced the shift. Guests who had been mocking or dismissive earlier now engaged with her politely, offering genuine compliments, asking questions with interest, and responding to her presence with warmth rather than amusement. Even the people who had been openly critical or sarcastic began to soften, their behavior reflecting the awareness that had entered the room. She noticed these changes, but she did not react outwardly to each one. Instead, she continued to move with the calm, steady grace that had carried her through the evening, allowing the environment itself to reflect her dignity. There were small, meaningful moments that punctuated the transformation. A guest who had previously laughed at a subtle jab approached her with sincere words of appreciation. Another, who had been quietly dismissive, paused mid-conversation, their expression softening as they realized their behavior had been inappropriate. These moments, small as they were, carried enormous significance. They demonstrated that respect could be restored not through conflict, but through subtle acknowledgement and human decency. She reflected on what had just happened. The humiliation she had endured earlier in the evening now felt distant, softened by the recognition that had been offered. It was not just about being defended or rescued, it was about having her presence, her contributions, and her character acknowledged publicly, and in a way that could not be ignored. That acknowledgement carried far more weight than any fleeting attempt at ridicule, and it reinforced the idea that dignity, patience, and composure often held greater power than immediate reaction. He continued to observe, ensuring that the moment maintained its subtle influence. His actions were deliberate, thoughtful, and never intrusive. By remaining present, by acknowledging her quietly but publicly, he ensured that the environment shifted permanently. The room's energy no longer allowed subtle cruelty to thrive. Respect had taken root, and the faint tension that had hung over the evening was replaced by an atmosphere of awareness and admiration. She began to feel a sense of quiet triumph, a realization that enduring humiliation with grace had not only preserved her dignity, but had also created an environment where respect was now visible. It was a reminder that true strength was not always loud or confrontational. Sometimes it was measured in small moments, quiet acknowledgments, and the ability to maintain integrity while others faltered. And the presence of someone who truly saw her had amplified that effect in a way that could not be replicated by words alone. As the evening continued, the subtle power of acknowledgement began to shape the remaining interactions. She noticed people engaging differently, listening more attentively, and treating her with a level of respect that had been absent earlier. The small acts of kindness, the genuine smiles, and the polite attention were all signs that the shift was real and meaningful. It was a testament to the quiet influence of human awareness and empathy, and the power of presence when used thoughtfully. By the end of this part of the evening, it was clear that a turning point had occurred. The humiliation that had marked the start of the event had been replaced by acknowledgement, respect, and awareness. She had not sought revenge or confrontation, yet the balance had shifted. Those who had been mocking her were now quiet, uncertain, and reflective. She had maintained her composure, embraced her dignity, and allowed the presence of someone who genuinely recognized her to reshape the environment. And in that moment, she understood a fundamental truth. Sometimes, the most profound victories are quiet, subtle, and rooted in human empathy. Even in the final moments of this part of the evening, small gestures continued to reinforce the change. Guests who had once whispered jokes now engaged with sincerity. Conversations became warmer, and the air was filled with an energy of acknowledgement rather than ridicule. She moved through the room with confidence, carrying the quiet triumph of knowing that dignity had prevailed. The subtle influence of someone who cared enough to notice had created a ripple effect, changing not only her experience but the atmosphere of the entire event. And as she continued to navigate the remaining moments of the night, she carried with her the knowledge that strength often lay in enduring, observing, and allowing truth to shine naturally. The quiet acknowledgement, the subtle support, and the deliberate human presence had transformed what could have been a night of humiliation into a moment of reflection, respect, and empowerment. She realized that dignity was not just a personal achievement, it had the power to influence others, to reshape interactions, and to leave a L. By the time the evening began to wind down, the room had completely transformed from the tense environment it had been earlier. The subtle whispers and hidden laughter that had once followed her every step had disappeared. Instead, the atmosphere was filled with warmth, acknowledgement, and a newfound respect that even the most skeptical guests could sense. She had moved through the event carrying her calm, grace, and poise, and now those qualities seemed to radiate outward. Affecting everyone around her, she walked with quiet confidence, each step deliberate, measured, and grounded. There was a sense of satisfaction in knowing that she had endured the initial humiliation with dignity, that she had not let the petty jokes and subtle cruelty define her evening. She could feel the energy in the room change as she passed through, guests now engaging with genuine warmth rather than mockery. Some offered small compliments, others paused in conversation to acknowledge her presence, and a few who had been openly dismissive now avoided eye contact. A faint unease betraying their awareness that their behavior had been noticed, He remained a subtle presence nearby, watching and supporting in a way that did not draw attention to himself. He had already shifted the energy earlier with a simple but powerful acknowledgement, and now he simply observed the ripple effect of that moment. He noticed how her calm confidence had encouraged others to reassess their actions, how respect had quietly replaced ridicule, and how dignity had become the defining tone of the evening. It was a quiet victory, not only for her but for the human values that had been momentarily overlooked in the room. She spoke with a few guests, offering polite conversation and small smiles. She began to realize the extent of the change around her. Those who had mocked her were now cautious, their laughter replaced with a subtle tension that revealed their awareness of what had transpired. It was not anger or revenge she had inspired, but reflection. They were beginning to see the consequences of their behavior without anyone needing to point it out explicitly. The recognition of her strength, patience, and composure had created an environment where cruelty could no longer thrive. She thought back to the earlier moments of the evening, the whispers, the subtle gestures meant to diminish her, the jokes at her expense. Each had felt sharp in the moment, but now they seemed almost distant, like shadows that had been dispelled by the light of recognition and respect. She had maintained her composure throughout, responding not with anger, but with calm, human grace. That composure had shifted the dynamics, showing that dignity is often more powerful than confrontation, and that patience can quietly overturn moments of humiliation. The people who had sought to embarrass her earlier now felt a subtle sense of regret. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others avoided eye contact, and a few exchanged brief, whispered comments that carried an awkward acknowledgement of their misjudgment. It was not dramatic, not a public humiliation, but a quiet human recognition that their actions had consequences. The evening had demonstrated that respect and acknowledgement could outweigh cruelty, and that the smallest gestures of empathy could have profound effects. She moved toward the final part of the program, where a few closing remarks were being made. Her steps were steady, her posture straight, and her expression calm yet radiant. She had learned throughout the evening that true strength lies in maintaining dignity, recognizing one's own worth and allowing subtle but meaningful actions to influence the environment. And now, as the room's energy had shifted, she could finally relax into the knowledge that her presence had been fully acknowledged and appreciated. A guest who had been particularly dismissive earlier approached her cautiously, offering genuine congratulations for her work and her contributions. She accepted the words with warmth and humility, not with bitterness or judgment. The exchange was brief but significant, representing the quiet ripple effect of her composure and the acknowledgement that had been offered. It was a moment of reconciliation, not forced, not dramatic, but human and meaningful. He continued to observe, noting how her presence now influenced the room. Conversations were warmer, laughter genuine rather than mocking, and attention more focused on shared experiences and respect rather than petty amusement. The subtle acts of recognition and acknowledgement had reshaped the atmosphere, showing how patience, dignity, and quiet observation could transform even the most uncomfortable situations into opportunities for human connection. As the final segment of the evening approached, she stood in the center of the room briefly, offering polite thanks for the opportunity to attend, acknowledging the event organizers and smiling at the guests. Her voice was calm and sincere, carrying a warmth that reflected her character rather than demanding attention. It was a culmination of the evening, a demonstration that dignity, grace, and quiet strength could not only withstand cruelty but also inspire reflection and respect in others. The room seemed to hold its breath for a brief moment, absorbing the shift. The subtle tension that had marked the beginning of the evening had dissolved entirely. Even those who had previously sought to diminish her now seemed to feel the weight of respect, the acknowledgement of her resilience, and the power of quiet dignity. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public shaming, just the natural consequences of human awareness and empathy. She paused briefly, taking in the room and the faces of the guests. She realized that the evening had not been about humiliation alone. It had been about the opportunity to observe, endure, and ultimately transform the environment through presence, patience, and calm. The subtle gestures of acknowledgement, the quiet support, and the careful observation of someone who truly saw her had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond her own experience. It was a reminder that human behavior is influenced by awareness, empathy, and the quiet assertion of dignity. Guests who had been dismissive earlier now engaged in genuine conversation, their expressions softening as they recognized her composure and the authenticity of her presence. Some apologized quietly for earlier remarks, not out of obligation but out of genuine acknowledgement of the shift that had occurred. Others simply nodded in silent understanding, their behavior reflecting the lessons learned from observing patience, resilience, and calm dignity in action. She moved through the crowd with a sense of relief and quiet triumph, recognizing that she had reclaimed the narrative of the evening without anger, confrontation, or drama. Her dignity had been maintained, her presence acknowledged, and the subtle cruelty of others had been diffused. The quiet support she had received earlier had created a foundation that allowed her to shine naturally. Without forcing attention or seeking validation, he remained nearby, observing the final moments, satisfied with the subtle but profound effect his acknowledgement had created. The evening had demonstrated the power of quiet action, human empathy, and awareness. Respect and recognition could transform an environment far more effectively than confrontation or spectacle, and dignity could influence even those who initially sought to diminish it. As the event drew to a close, she reflected on the night's journey. She had endured humiliation, navigated subtle cruelty, and maintained her composure throughout. She had received acknowledgement, observed the transformation in the room, and witnessed the quiet regret of those who had mocked her. And through it all, she realized that strength is often measured not by immediate reactions, but by patience, dignity, and the ability to let truth and character shine through. In the final moments, the energy in the room was markedly different from when the evening began. Respect had replaced ridicule, acknowledgement had replaced whispers, and dignity had replaced discomfort. She could feel the impact of her composure, the subtle influence of support, and the natural transformation of the environment around her. It was a quiet victory, one that demonstrated the power of patience, empathy, and human connection. She left the event with a sense of calm accomplishment. The humiliation she had endured earlier now seemed like a distant memory, softened by the recognition and respect she had received. She had navigated a challenging environment with grace, maintained her dignity, and influenced those around her without needing confrontation or drama. The evening had become a testament to the power of quiet strength, human empathy, and the importance of acknowledging the worth of others, even after leaving the event. She carried with her the lessons of the night. The subtle acts of recognition, the quiet support, and the calm composure she had maintained had created ripples that would extend far beyond the room. She understood that humiliation could be endured, respect could be earned through dignity, and human behavior could be influenced by patience, awareness, and empathy. The people who had sought to belittle her earlier left the event with a quiet awareness of their own actions. They had witnessed, either consciously or unconsciously, the strength, patience, and dignity she displayed. There were no harsh words, no public shaming, only the subtle but undeniable sense of regret and reflection. The evening had shown them that cruelty has consequences, even when it is hidden behind polite smiles or whispers. She had not sought revenge or recognition for herself. Her goal had always been to remain true to her values, to endure, and to allow the truth of her character to shine. And indeed,